morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Mel. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Australian Chamber of Commerce, and I'm really excited to be here today with our distinguished guests. I will introduce them in just a moment. I'd just like to say our acknowledgement of country. So the custom of acknowledging and paying respect to country has been carried out in Australia for tens of thousands of years. I'd like us all to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, past and present. I also want to acknowledge that there are people in this meeting from the ancestral territories of First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples of Canada. So I would also like to acknowledge these peoples and their territories and ask us all to reflect on how we have benefited from their continued care and custodianship of these territories. The CACC believes it is important for us to understand that our living and working on these Indigenous lands places a significant burden on country and on its custodians, and for all of us to try and lessen that burden as much as we can. So I'd like to introduce two people to start. John Chadwick is a partner at PwC, and he's leading the Global Energy Transition Lead for PwC. It's a newly formed energy transition business. John brings global insights and world-leading capabilities to clients facing the most complex and pressing challenges of our time, an orderly and just energy transition. So John will be leading the conversation with Fiona, Kylie, and Saul. But without further ado, I do want to introduce our keynote speaker for today, His Excellency Mark Glauser, High Commissioner of Canada to Australia. Welcome, Mark. I'd like to just go into a little bit about your background, because it is quite impressive. Mark has been in this position since October 2019. He joined right before the pandemic hit in Australia. He's also the High Commissioner for Nauru, High Commissioner Designate to Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, and Ambassador to the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. He is a career diplomat, having previously served abroad in Geneva, Switzerland, Amman, Jordan, and Washington, D.C. During his 30 years of public service, he has held a number of leadership positions in Ottawa and abroad, dealing with international security, national security and intelligence, Canada-US relations, and the Middle East. And welcome, Mark. Thank you for joining.
Thanks very much, Mel. Look, can I also start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands from where I'm speaking today, the Ngunnawal people, and their elders past, present, and emerging. So thanks very much to Mel and the CACC for organizing this really important discussion on the transition to clean economies. I'd like to touch on some core ideas and on some recent developments. They're foundational for Canadian companies doing business, an increasing amount of business in Australia and with Canadian investors. First, some big picture stuff. Many people were talking about the clean economy before the pandemic, but the pandemic gave us time to stop and think. It showed us that big changes in small periods of time are possible. All that thinking accelerated some changes that were already underway. And make no mistake, the change is really profound. The change to a clean economy is one of the most significant developments since the Industrial Revolution. It's on the same level of importance as the introduction of the microchip in the 1960s and the shift to a data-driven economy this century. It cuts across all sectors. It's not just about clean tech as a sector. All sectors can be cleaner. It's why Canada, Australia, the US, and every other one of our friends and partners are investing heavily in building clean economies and the net zero industries of tomorrow, today. There's also the current political context. In addition to the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has revealed to the world's democracies the risks of economic reliance on others who are not our friends. So as a result, many allies are moving quickly to friendshore their economies and build their supply chains through economies like our own. We know we're at an inflection point in history. We've all learned the hard way that just-in-time supply chains expose us to significant risks. So from a Canadian perspective, we're working to build a Canadian economy, indeed an anchor of the North American economy, that's the most competitive, prosperous, and resilient economic region in the world. And that clean, resilient, competitive North American economy can be of enormous benefit to Australian business. Canadian companies are already world leaders in the clean economy. They rely on the expertise of Canadian workers, the ingenuity of Canadian entrepreneurs, and the resources that Canada has in such fortunate abundance. So what are we doing? The Canadian government's made a number of moves to support our shift to a clean economy. That support can be of benefit to Australian companies. We've done a number of things over the last few years. Today, I would like to focus on developments in Canada's most recent budget, 2023. Tabled last month, the finance minister announced our plan to build the Canadian clean economy with a plan that includes over $80 billion in investments. The budget includes new incentives that will encourage global companies to invest in Canada. These include, for example, a refundable tax credit equal to 30% of the cost of investments in new machinery and equipment used to manufacture or process clean technologies, extract, process, or recycle critical minerals. Second, a 15% refundable tax credit to eligible investments in non-emitting electricity generation systems. And a refundable tax credit ranging from 15 to 40% of eligible project costs, with the projects that produce the cleanest hydrogen receiving the highest levels of support. And other pre-existing incentives will also be enhanced. All of this makes us more competitive in a North American economy shaped by recent US legislation, including the provisions of the recent US Inflation Reduction Act. And all of this is in addition to the substantial investment tax credits Canada announced last year for carbon capture, utilization and storage, clean hydrogen, and the adoption of clean technologies. Whether it's clean energy, clean technology, or battery manufacturing, Canada is becoming a world leader in the clean economy. We're going to build a clean electrical grid that connects Canadians from coast to coast to coast, protects our environment, and delivers cleaner, more affordable electricity to Canadians and Canadian business. And we're making Canada a reliable supplier of clean energy to our allies and to the world. We're making Canada the very best place in the world for businesses to invest. We're the only G7 country with free trade deals with all other G7 allies. So opening an office in Canada is good for Australian business. And from critical minerals to electric vehicles, we're going to ensure that Canadian workers mine, process, build, and sell the goods and resources that our allies need. We're really at a unique moment in history where the markets, the will of the people, the good of the environment are all converging to create a new 21st century reality, that climate action must be the foundation of the economy and the development of our societies. So, let's spend a moment on critical minerals, as they, like battery technologies, hydrogen and solar power, they're all the high performers. So critical minerals, we're both mining countries. Canada has supplies of 31 critical minerals and already produces 21 of them. Canada ranks among the top 5 producing countries for 13 major minerals and metals. We're first in potash, second in uranium and niobium, third in nickel, cobalt, aluminum, and the platinum group metals, and fifth in gold and diamonds. We're also home to advanced exploration projects for lithium and graphite, rare earths, and other critical minerals. Australia has supplies of 26 critical minerals. Australia is the world's biggest exporter of lithium and produces many others as well. But, like Canada, not all its critical minerals are being mined right now. And critical minerals are key to the clean economy. To be part of that story in the best way possible, mining operations need to be clean as well. We already know that world-leading companies in Australia are heading in this direction. Our mining value chains are already working together, and they can do more with Canadian technology. So the changes to our economies matter to our people. A recent poll shows that 75% of Canadians agree that climate change is a threat that requires urgent action, and more than half are concerned about the impact of climate change on the economy. The Canadian government is laying the groundwork in collaboration with business across the country to achieve a more prosperous and sustainable Canada. Our goal of net zero by 2050 is the foundation for the future we're building, and it's a target that's gaining momentum all over the world, including here in Australia. Over the years, we've taken significant action toward this goal. The first ever pan-Canadian climate plan, the implementation of federal carbon pricing, and tabling net zero legislation. In March of 2022, we launched a sector-by-sector roadmap to cut emissions by 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. All of this is good for Australia and for Australian companies looking to do more in the clean economy. Australian companies know that Canadian companies are ideal partners. Canadian SMEs have products and expertise to help change your operations. And Australian investors can look to Canadian mines and other industries as opportunities. Canada acknowledges the transition will take time, but it can use its current capabilities in hydrocarbons, for example, to support this transition. With an abundant supply of responsibly produced oil and gas, Canada is in a position to help meet the world's immediate demand for energy, because oil and gas is anticipated to be the world's largest energy sources till at least 2040. Canadian companies are seeing that investment in emissions reduction results in an increased return on investment. The oil and gas industry is diversifying and repurposing assets to support decarbonization. ESG certified gas production is being adopted. Existing facilities such as refineries are being adapted to serve the green energy industry. And conventional oil and gas wells are being repurposed as geothermal wells. The service sector also offers investment opportunity. A few examples: methane leak detection and repair, digitization and automation of rigs, waste heat recovery technology, water recycling, land reclamation. So how can we help? The Trade Commissioner Service exists to support and facilitate this collaboration. Our team here in Australia has unique reach back to Canada and a comprehensive understanding of the Canadian ecosystem. It can make connections that will make Australian business better, cleaner, more competitive with Canadian products and services in your business model. Canada is collaborating with stakeholders and jurisdictions across the country and around the world to bring innovative and competitive clean technology to market. Canada's low R&D costs, highly skilled workforce, wealth of natural resources, and support for innovation make it attractive for clean technology development and commercialization. The Trade Commissioner Service can do a number of things: provide introductions to a range of key contacts in the government, private sector, academia, provide industry-specific regulatory environment information, provide insights on government programs that can help you set up a business in Canada, access tax credits and other incentives, provide cost benchmarks between different jurisdictions, help in insight selection and organize site visits, all in addition to understanding the whole Canadian ecosystem and all the companies present in it. One final key ingredient is the close relationship between the Canadian government and our Australian government counterparts. This includes at the national level and especially at the state level, where things get really practical. This includes New South Wales, who are present with us today. Over the last few years, I've seen all of this in action. Indeed, in the year since Australia really reopened, I've been to a number of trade shows. I've seen Canadian companies, products, technology, expertise on display. I walked the floor of IMAR this year, and I couldn't get 2 feet without seeing Canadian technology and services. I've seen this with HydroStore, with ATCO Power, and with CarbonCure, to cite just 3 examples. CarbonCure, for example, is putting CO2 into fresh concrete, making concrete stronger. And I've seen collaboration in action in my conversation with ministers and senior officials across Australia. So, to sum up, my 3 core messages are: first, we're in this together, Canada and Australia. We're complementary partners much more than we're competitors, especially in a world where supply chain security matters. Second, the clean economy is not about one sector. Every sector matters. Every sector uses power. Third, there's lots of great Canadian technology. Canadian companies can help Australia and Australian companies achieve their goals. And there's a lot of great investment opportunities in Canada. We can help with that too. My final thought is this: the clean economy is good business, good for business, and better for the planet. As we help each other achieve the same objectives for our countries and their people, there's tremendous economic opportunity, and the planet will be better for it. Thank you.
Thanks, Your Excellency, Mark Glauser, High Commissioner for Canada to Australia. We do appreciate your comments, and we do understand that you are a very busy individual and can't stay for the rest of the conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Great pleasure, Mel. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to hand the reins over to John to lead the panel discussion. But before I do, I thought I'd intro our speakers, and it's such an honor to have the 3 of you here today. This thought leadership that we have is just invaluable. And I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on this clean energy transition. And in no particular order, your bios are so comprehensive. I don't think I can get to all of them. But I'm just going to do a bit of a highlight because you all are very established individuals. So first, Kylie Bell, Deputy Secretary and Managing Director, Trade and Investment. Kylie leads the New South Wales Government's Trade and Investment Group, which delivers on the New South Wales Government's priority of driving economic prosperity by taking the best of New South Wales to the world and bringing the best of the world to New South Wales. And just a bit of highlights. Kylie and her team are located across New South Wales in 21 international cities. I was really excited to hear and meet the new appointment in Toronto. So there is somebody in Canada, very excited about that. And amongst her 30 years of experience in global trade and investment, her career, she's lived and worked across a number of areas, India, Asia, Europe, and Australia. So thank you, Kylie, for coming. Then I'll just go with ladies first. We have Dr. Fiona Wild from BHP. Fiona is got 25 years of experience in sustainability and climate change, and she just happens to hold a degree and PhD in chemistry. So, she knows what she's doing. She's been with BHP since 2010. She has such a vast experience, but I just wanted to highlight in December 2015, she was appointed to the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures reporting to the G20. That provides the global benchmark on how financial and non-financial companies should disclose climate-related information to ensure financial risk can be better measured and managed. She also holds several board positions, including the deputy chair of the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and of course has represented BHP at International Council of Mining and Metals and the World Economic Forum. And last but not least, we have Saul Griffith, an inventor, an author, a founder, and scientist. Saul is an engineer and entrepreneur specializing in clean and renewable energy. He's founded a dozen technology companies across 20 years in Silicon Valley, and he's authored 3 books that include Electrify, The Big Switch. Saul has recently turned his attention to other lab, his independent research and development lab, to policy work, writing, including Rewiring America and Rewiring Australia. So again, this is just a snippet of their experience. So we have some pretty amazing thought leadership here today, and I'm going to hand the reins over to John to lead this discussion.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mel. And like you, very excited to host this panel today and to hear the different perspectives that we've got. I'm coming from Wurundjeri country here today in Melbourne and grew up in Mi'kmaq country in Nova Scotia in Canada as well. So really value this partnership between Canada and Australia, and hoping to contribute to the conversation around the similarities and also the differences between the countries here today too. Really like to get right into it, if I can, gang, and looking at the overview of the energy transition and really diving into how we heard His Excellency speak about the clean energy economy and how Canada is positioned in the similarities between Australia and Canada. I'd love to hear your perspectives as well. Maybe starting with Kylie around how do you think Australia and Canada are positioned in this clean energy economy?
Well, thank you. And I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in Sydney, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Look, as the High Commissioner spoke, I almost thought his speech he could also be talking on behalf of the Australian government. So I guess the point I would make is, A, I don't work for the Australian government, I work for a state government. But B, there is enormous similarities between what Canada is trying to achieve and certainly what my state in New South Wales is trying to do. We are and have been a major exporter of coal. As a state, it has, I guess, across the country, it has been one of the drivers of our economy, if I'm particularly on a world stage. But at the moment, my government is definitely working towards a net zero target by 2050 of zero. And we're looking at 50% reduction by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. So it is front and foremost, I think, in all governments, in all business and in industry. And one of the things as a government we need to look at is how we as a government, provide services, incentives, and policy that enables businesses like BHP to transition from, I guess, what I would call traditional energy to future energy sources. And so in New South Wales, we've developed a range of policies to support that, and looking at how we can build new industries, for example, green hydrogen, and of course, solar and wind and other traditional renewables. So I think it keeps a lot of people awake at night. And it is absolutely front and foremost of every conversation that I think government has, both internally, but also with industry. As the High Commissioner said, every business is responsible for helping achieve our net zero tasks, because every business and every household and every consumer across the country, and of course across the world, uses energy. So this is something that we need to work on together.
Fantastic.
I might pause there.
No, that's great. Thank you, Kylie. Saul, coming to you next. You've obviously working with a number of governments, including you've spoken to the Canadian government, you've had conversations with the Australian government and the American government, working a lot with them as well. How do you see us positioned?
I think it's extremely exciting moment in human history because of the level of transformation, and maybe just to, sorry to be the downer, but the net zero 2050 targets were based on what we could have done if we started in 2018. We need to remind the world that we didn't do anything. In fact, we've increased carbon emissions since then. And the honest assessment now is that zero emissions 2040 is the 1.5 degree target. So I say that just so that we continue to raise our ambition appropriately for our children and generations to come. That said, I think we are starting to see the first genuine efforts at a policy level to really address climate, which has always been very important. You can't do this with technology alone. The most regulated industry on earth is the energy industry. So it is necessarily a project for government and the private sector and the citizenry. I think the extraordinary thing that happened with the Inflation Reduction Act is a new level of ambition that is resetting ambition globally. So, and I think the positive feedback of ambition begetting more ambition is really important. I will say that the Inflation Reduction Act will not achieve even net zero by 2050 in and of itself. So it is not enough. We need more legislation. We also had the Infrastructure Investment Act in the US, and now some efforts through the EPA to regulate vehicle fleet, which hopefully get closer to where they need to be. But this is what I mean. Even the governments that are most ambitious now need to beget some more ambition. The revolution of the Inflation Reduction Act was for the first time to consider the demand side of the energy equation on an equal footing with the supply side of the equation. I think that's a revolution in America that I'm hoping to also see in Australia and Canada, but we haven't yet. We are very supply side focused countries because we're very export focused. But the Inflation Reduction Act will deliver savings to the American people in their energy use by underwriting and helping usher in electrification of households and small businesses, which actually are responsible for 70% of the emissions in the US economy. We need to have that same demand side representation in Australian and Canadian policy. We haven't seen that yet, but I'm looking forward to that, including starting in the budget here in Australia next week. I'm not going to delight His Excellency with what I'm about to say, but what truly excites me about being in Australia at the moment is, of all the countries in the world, we have the easiest shot on goal of getting to zero emissions fastest in our domestic economy. Canada is a little colder and a little darker. That's part of the reason. Australia had some regulatory success around rooftop solar that has made that the cheapest energy ever in human history delivered to retail customers. If you can use Australian rooftop solar to power your electric car, that's a cost of 2 cents per kilometre to drive, comparable to 25 cents per kilometre if you're running on petrol or diesel. That means that Australia is motivated economically to go as fast as possible because it is now in the economic interest of Australian households, small businesses, and the country to get there even faster than we might think, and that means we can afford much bolder legislation than even the Inflation Reduction Act. That will, and as we know, we supply chain shortages everywhere. This is all about getting the precious metals to deliver the technologies that we need for the future. We know that these technologies are on learning curves. Doubling the production of solar will reduce the cost another 20%, doubling the cost of wind, doubling the production of wind reduces it by 10%, doubling the production of batteries reduces the cost by 30%. We need to double each of those by 5 or 6 times to get to the international scale. So there's an amazing statement that the faster you go, the faster we make this cheap energy revolution happen. And so hopefully by Australia going fast and hard, we will buy down the cost of this for our friends in Canada. And then maybe just to be a little bit contrarian, I am concerned for both Canada and Australia over investing in hydrogen. I think there will be hydrogen. There's absolutely, we need it for ammonia, and we might need it for a few other niche sectors. But the dialogue in Australia is as though it's going to be the majority of the future energy supply. It is an inefficient energy storage mechanism and will necessarily be more expensive than direct electrification for nearly every sector. And it is to misinterpret the Inflation Reduction Act, where only a couple of % of that was focused on hydrogen and really only on potential hydrogen projects. And I worry and I caution both countries not to overinvest in a speculative technology, given, honestly, we've only got 17 years, so it's got to be the stuff that's working.
That's great. Thank you, Saul. We'll come back to a few of those topics as we go along today. Fiona, I might throw to you for a moment. As a company who operates in both countries, what kind of similarities, and we heard the ambassador talk about some of those similarities, and what are the key differences you see between how the countries are positioned and where they're up to with their clean economy transition?
Sure. Well, I guess the similarities, as Kylie's mentioned as well, and also His Excellency, is the great resource endowment that we see in both Australia and Canada. And it's interesting, when I'm talking to people around the world about policy settings to drive decarbonisation, you often find that Australia and Canada come from the same kind of starting point, because we're dealing with the same types of emissions profiles, we're dealing with the same types of challenges in terms of technology developments that are required, because we're actually very similarly sourced economies with a high focus on export of commodities and a very technological base of the economy. So I think there's a great similarity there. I think the differences are probably more around what I see in terms of the acknowledgement of and the drive for competitiveness in that resource base. So I think with Canada, for example, launching its critical minerals strategy, you see a really, really strong focus on encouraging investment into Canada to access those resources and scale up their production and export and domestic consumption. I think at the moment, Australia is probably a little bit further behind. So there are a few things that we would need to do in Australia to really make sure that we're accessing those resources in the most competitive way. So for example, it's not necessarily about taking the IRA and mirroring exactly the subsidies or the investment tools that are identified in the IRA, but it might be looking at things like, how do we speed up the approvals processes and streamline those approvals processes so we can actually get access to the resources that we need more quickly? How might we look at improving productivity in industrial relations to make sure that we can get more people to actually access these resources and get them out? How might we invest in infrastructure and capability building to make sure that we actually have the foundation that we need to scale up production and use of these critical minerals? So I feel like perhaps Canada has a stronger focus on the resource that it has and an understanding of how valuable that is. I think sometimes Australia is a little bit further behind. So we have, for example, the largest global endowment of copper at BHP that we're waiting to access. It can be really, really difficult to actually bring this commodity to market. And given that copper is such an incredibly important commodity in terms of decarbonisation, so an electric vehicle, for example, has 4 times more copper in it than an internal combustion engine run vehicle. So the demand for copper is going through the roof, but it's actually really hard to get these projects off the ground. So we need to start thinking about how we can actually expedite those processes and how to drive investment in Australia, particularly when there are other countries like the US and Canada that are actually creating a much more competitive environment, and the momentum in terms of commodity development may be shifting to other locations.
No, very insightful, Fiona. And in terms of those, we talked about the competitiveness. What about uncertainties, and what sort of uncertainties are you facing as a business, you know, in both of those economies as well? Anything that's going to hold us up?
It's a really interesting question. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, we had lots of conversations about, well, what does this mean? You know, when you get these kind of very near-term dramatic events that happen, people say, well, what does it mean? Does it mean you kind of do other things like the trend around decarbonisation get delayed? Does it kind of push things off track? I think previously, so over the last sort of 20 years, there have been occasions where very, very significant geopolitical events have really slowed down momentum on decarbonisation. What I see now is that momentum in the system around decarbonisation, I think, is like there is no stopping it. There is just no stopping it. And if anything, the invasion of Ukraine from Russia has actually accelerated the momentum, because it's pushing people to think about, what are my alternatives? How can I build energy security? How can I improve my long-term perspective in terms of energy security? So I think although things do change significantly on a sort of shorter term basis, that global megatrend around decarbonisation is set. The question for us is which commodities and when to deploy. And so, you know, Saul mentioned about particular technology. So sometimes people will put a bet on a particular technology, and Saul probably didn't expect this, but I completely agree with him about hydrogen. People are putting a lot of money, well, a lot of hope in hydrogen as a technology, and hydrogen will have a role to play, but actually electrifying everything and using electrons to get your power out is a much more efficient way. So when we're looking, for example, at how do we decarbonize our truck fleet, we have a huge number of trucks around the world and they all use diesel. When we're looking at ways to decarbonize our truck fleet, we're not looking at hydrogen, because we don't want to have an interim step where we're producing hydrogen and then having to take it again and turn it into electrons for power. We just want to go straight to electrons. So we're looking at electrifying trucks because we think that's the most efficient way to do it. And I do worry that we get these moments where people say, no, this is the technology that you need. Actually, we need all the technologies, and we need all of them now. So I do get a little bit worried sometimes with uncertainty, which is driven by people's favorite technology, people's kind of pet technology. Do all of them, do them more than you ever imagined that you would, but don't knock things out and don't overemphasize one over the other. Do all of it and do it fast.
Oh, that's great, Fiona. Kylie, what about you in terms of your constituents, in terms of the businesses of New South Wales, as well as the investors coming into New South Wales? What kind of uncertainties are they raising with you, and you know, how can we start addressing those?
So obviously within my group, we do a lot of work internationally. As I think Mel mentioned upfront, we're in 21 locations. So we talk a lot, for example, with businesses from North Asia. We talk a lot about businesses in India, across the Asia-Pac region in particular. And they are all going through exactly the same, I guess, transition that we are. And they've typically looked to markets like Canada and Australia as a source of energy. So certainly Australia has been a major exporter across ASEAN to North Asia and into India of coal to help them with their, I guess, their energy requirements. So they're now coming to us looking for what that next wave of, I guess, energy will be, which is, I think, where hydrogen has come in. Domestically, most of our wind in New South Wales most of our energy will come from, obviously, renewables, and we too have a very strong focus on electrification. But a lot of our neighbours that relied on us to provide fossil fuel energy are now coming to us saying, we're not going to be able to meet our domestic requirements through renewables. We're you know, in Japan or Korea, we're not going to be able to use solar and wind to generate all of our energy, and we are going to be looking to Australia and no doubt Canada for new energy sources. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we've seen a lot of particularly European companies come to Australia over the last 10 or 15 years with their solutions. And in fact, Canadian companies Amazingly, Canada is Australia's 4th largest source of foreign direct investment. And a lot of that, in the media, we always talk about Asian investment in Australia, but actually Canadian investment has grown enormously over the last 5 to 10 years. And it's the energy transition is typically what is driving that investment. So I think as we develop our domestic solutions, we are a global world. And I guess markets like Australia and Canada have typically been trading countries. And so we'll be probably asked not just to look at our own energy solutions, but also work with our, our neighbours in regions to help them as well with that transition. So I guess in my work, we're always thinking about what's the implications of what does that have on us? But more importantly, then what does that mean for, what we're doing in Japan or in other parts of the world? So,
fantastic. Well, thank you. So you mentioned the IRA, Fiona mentioned the IRA, everyone's talking about the IRA, and you delved into it a little bit there, but can we just take a step back and tell us what it is, and more importantly, how does it impact Australia and or Canada, if at all?
I think the IRA is honestly very misunderstood, even by people who were involved in writing it. First, you have to remember it was a highly imperfect political setup with which the IRA was written. The Democrats did not have a supermajority in the Senate, and they weren't prepared to overthrow the filibuster. So they couldn't write legislation. It was really a spending bill. So it has been described as carrots, 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 and more carrots. And that's because it was only carrots as a possibility for the mechanisms. So it was deeply, the initial goals of the White House climate team were more expansive, but they were reduced to using the tax code, basically. There's some good and bad about that. The good side is you hear in the media that the Inflation Reduction Act is a $369 billion bill. That's as it was scored by the Congressional Budget Office. But in fact, just in consumer rebates, if they were fully utilized, so the CBO guesses how well these rebates will be utilized. If they're fully utilized just for consumer rebates, there's about $1 trillion. So the Inflation Reduction Act will be as successful as it is advertised and deployed, and that is still a question mark, but it could be much, much more shaping. It was very much shaped and designed to permanently transform the marketplace so that every consumer decision or every business decision would be advantaged by choosing the right decision, mostly electric. It really did not address all components of the American economy. There were people there representing and writing for the transportation sector and electric vehicles and vehicle charging infrastructure. There was a lot of effort around the households and buildings, but really the commercial sector and the industrial sector were largely not included in the Inflation Reduction Act, certainly not pro rata to their importance in the economy. So there's a lot of reason to believe that you can do better. There's a fear that it has a lot of, Buy American provisions in it. I've heard that used in Australia and Canada to provoke fear that we're going to miss out. It's not true. We are favored trading nations. We count as American made for all of the Inflation Reduction Act. So in every single way, it advantages us to play along because it will be our minerals going into those American-made car batteries. So we needn't fear that. The fear, if there should be any of the Inflation Reduction Act, is not moving as quickly on the electrification of our domestic economies, because we will end up not quite being the dumping ground, but certainly being the end of the global supply chain in terms of electric vehicles and electric appliances, unless we similarly motivate. And I think there's a good argument to be even more ambitious about domestic economy electrification. So unlike a lot of pundits I hear in Australia are saying we should be fearful of the Inflation Reduction Act, I don't think we should be fearful. I think we should see it as a wonderful, if slightly flawed blueprint. We should be more ambitious. We should embrace it and support America and its goals. And we should be more ambitious in our own domestic economies, because honestly, for both Canada and Australia, we have an easier shot on goal here.
And lots of talk about what is, we've heard the ambassador talk about the Canadian response to it. Lots of talk about what an Australian response could be to it. Any insights or any opinions on what you think Australia should do to take advantage of that and to move forward on it, use it as a blueprint?
Well, we should provide America with a blueprint for the commercial sector and the industrial sector. So that would be new ideas and new mechanisms. The safeguard mechanism might be considered a flawed down payment, but we could afford to outdo America on the Inflation Reduction Act by being whole economy and not as misbalanced. The other problem of it being a spending bill is it's essentially a regressive piece of regressive social policy. So you only qualify for the majority of the rebates and subsidies in the US if you reach a certain tax-paying threshold. So unlike what actually was the goal of the White House, which was to do, to get some social justice alongside this climate action, it hasn't turned out that way. So I think if you worry that 5 years into this project, there might be a bit of a social uprising if only the rich people can afford the Teslas and Lycra and lattes and etc., then I think the opportunity in Australia is to show a more democratic and a more economically progressive version of that. Let's think about ideas that are big enough. So we doubled the number of people who had access to higher education in Australia with the invention of HECS, which was a income-dependent set of loans. So you only had to pay back the debt when you reached certain levels of income, and it made higher education broadly more affordable. I won't use that as the exact template, but that should be the level of ambition and scale we have so that we enable every Australian household, and Canada should think along the same lines. We should enable every single household to afford these solutions, because you must remember the households that will benefit the most from these economic savings on energy are low-income households, where for a lot of low-income households, this is true in Canada and in Australia, more than 10% of their household spending is on energy. For the wealthiest households, it's single digit, 1 or 2%. So it really, we need to make sure we figure out, for both making sure that this is legislation that lasts, but both that also that it helps the neediest segments of our population. We need to figure out how to write the legislation so that everyone can afford to participate in this future.
Excellent. Kylie, I saw you nodding along to some of Saul's points there, and obviously this would be a big discussion point for you and in your role. Talk to us about the opportunities or the threats, or how's it seen by the people you're speaking to?
Well, I won't talk on US policy just because I don't think it's always appropriate for the other governments to do that. But Saul absolutely hit the nail on the head that if we need to look at how we incentivize consumers. I guess there's capital costs involved for every household involved in transitioning from one source of energy to another. And rather than potentially incentivizing large organizations, finding ways for it to become cost effective for households to make the transitions through their own choice will be what drives things. So it was more, I just nodded, nodded in agreement that I had never even considered a HECS for new energy, but you know, every kid in Australia has been able to access higher education through that program. So look, just when I think about the opportunities, I mean, they're kind of significant. So I might throw, if it's okay, to Fiona just to talk about it from a business point of view. But when I look at what's happened in New South Wales around, 20 years ago, we invested significantly through our institutions in, for example, research in solar energy that's, now being used around the world. And so now looking at how we can be working through, I guess, our research and development as well around energy storage, and looking at how, I'm talking from a government point of view, how we can not only be influencing policy around what energy we use, but also influencing how we innovate to continue to identify new ways of doing things more cost effectively, I think is critical as government. Often, and Saul is right, he keeps raising his hands. I don't know if you can see him, but
I can chime in there. You know, there was a big hole in the Inflation Reduction Act was a lack of investment in human capital. In Australia, we are short tens of thousands of electricians to get this job done on time. We're short tens of thousands of HVAC technicians. And I applaud your call for investments in R&D, and we absolutely need to do that. And we need to create the next Martin Greens, and we need to fund and underwrite the next solar department at the University of New South Wales. But actually, this revolution, more than anything, needs blue-collar and skilled trade workers on boots on the ground. This comes after 20 years of damaging our TAFE and our education systems and skilled trade building systems, including our apprenticeship systems. I would love to see any Australian response to the Inflation Reduction Act really have an enormous investment in the human capital required.
Fiona, you're nodding your head here too. We can touch on the human capital piece, and you know, I'm sure you guys are facing a lot of challenges around the skills that are required to address this, as well as would love to hear a bit from you around how the IRA is influencing your decisions on where to make investment across Australia, across Canada, across the US as well.
Certainly on the skills topic, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, mining isn't a terribly sexy industry. It's not like a lot of people get to the end of school and think, you know what, I really want to do? I want to go and work in the mining industry. No, maybe I'm a bit weird because I always really wanted to work in resources, because I just kind of figure if you want to reduce emissions, you want to go to the place where the emissions are, because then you get to do it at scale. So for me, it was a decision about going where I can have the biggest impact. But it's hard to get people into the industry, and it's hard to keep them there, because I think one of the things that we find is people don't necessarily understand the role of critical minerals in decarbonisation. So people don't often understand that copper is really important when you're thinking about an electric vehicle, or that you need nickel in an EV battery, or even really simple things like, I remember having conversations with people about wind turbines. And people say, we need more wind turbines, but we don't really want the products that you make, BHP. And I said, well, what do you think wind turbines are made of? And they said, well, they're made of maybe metal. It's like, yeah, do you know what metal they're made of? Is it steel? And then I said, do you know what steel's made from? And they said, no. I said, well, it's made from iron ore or metallurgical coal. So it's not to suggest that every single ton of iron ore or metallurgical coal goes in to make wind turbines, but a hell of a lot of it does. And so you do need to think about the role of these critical minerals and these commodities in actually enabling this transition. And you'll see that commodities will have their moment in the sun, things will transition. But for things like copper and nickel, they have a really, really strong future. You know, the analysis we've done, which looks at a 1.5 degree scenario. So in other words, a world where the average increase in global temperatures is limited to 1.5 degrees, which is what the Paris Agreement is really pushing for. In that world, you're going to need to have 4 times as much nickel in the next 30 years as you did in the last 30, twice as much copper, twice as much uranium, twice as much steel. So this demand for these minerals and these critical minerals is increasing all of the time, and it's absolutely linked to decarbonisation. But trying to get people to come into the industry to enable that to happen is increasingly difficult. And we're seeing really, really low levels of support for these, you know, geometallurgy, minerals processing type skills, which you're going to need at every point of that value chain to get these commodities produced and out the door, particularly if you're going to look at things like downstream processing in Australia, which a lot of people are talking about now, particularly when it comes to things like green hydrogen. So that there is there needs to be a really strong focus on capability. And part of that is about helping people understand how important these minerals are to decarbonisation, because we know that people are highly motivated for purpose-driven work in the same way that I am, but people don't often understand the role that mining can play in delivering on that broader purpose. Just in coming back to the IRA, I think when we look at the IRA and we look at the critical minerals strategy in Canada, it's obviously accelerating momentum around the investment. I think I read somewhere that in the last 8 months, I think the level of clean energy investment as a result of the IRA's introduction is something like 150 billion, which is about the same level of investment that they've seen in the last 5 years. So you can see that the IRA has been a real sort of accelerant or a catalyst to investment in the US. And we see in Canada, there's a very, very supportive environment. So we've been investing in Canada for many years now, and it's our major potash province. We have an enormous potash development underway in Saskatchewan in Canada. And a lot of that is driven by the really good fiscal settings in Canada and the really supportive policy environment, because there is an understanding of the critical role these minerals can play, particularly for potash, in terms of making sure that we get more agricultural productivity and we don't have to trade off land use for food versus land use for other things. So there's a very, very supportive environment. Plus, there's a really good understanding of how local communities and Indigenous communities can support that development. So I think it then becomes incumbent on Australia to think about, well, how do we encourage investment here? How do we make sure we invest in the capability that we need? How do we get the infrastructure in place to drive these value chains? And how do we get the workplace reforms in place to make labour more cost effective, more productive? And how do we manage some of these approvals processes, which make it so very, very difficult to actually get these processes and projects off the ground?
Fantastic. Thank you, Fiona. I'm getting the wrap-up signal. We're almost out of time, and I just feel like we're ramping up. So it's a shame, but we'll have more of these conversations over the next year. So I'm really looking forward to those as well, which Mel will cover in a moment. Want to put each of you on the spot for a minute. Three words on where this clean economy is going to go, where this clean economy transition is going to go over the next 20 years. 3 words. Let's hit Saul first.
So we can copy Saul's words.
No.
Go on, Saul.
So just 3 words and where you think the future is on clean economy.
Unprecedented speed, ampersand, because it doesn't count as a word, scale. Unprecedented speed and scale.
Excellent. Thank you. Kylie.
I was going to use some sort of Vin Diesel movie analogy and say Fast and Furious.
Fast and Furious.
But I don't know if that's the real thing I can say. But
It's also only 2 words by my accounting.
At Fast and Furious, there's and is definite word.
He was using, yeah, that's right. And Fiona, how about you?
Oh, those are tough acts to follow. I'm going to go speed, scale, impact.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And thank you to all 3 of you for a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to continuing the conversation as we move through the year and beyond. I might hand back to Mel now just to go through some thank yous and next steps.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, John, for leading that discussion. So I would love to invite you back, hopefully face to face. It is nice virtual because we can beam it out to everybody, but there's nothing that replaces a face-to-face discussion. So I really want to thank you for your time, PwC, BHP, and Investment New South Wales, and Saul. I mean, you have so many endeavors, other lab to mention. I'd also want to note that the CACC, we're a not-for-profit, volunteer-based organization, and our mission is to promote trade and investment between Australia and Canada, but clearly there are opportunities here for both countries on a global scale. And so, we do have to speak about, issues in India and America and all the other regions that affect our 2 nations. So I would love to invite you back for another session. And I really do want to thank you so much for your time today.